All right, so we're diving into some selections from Oswald Spengler and this book, The Hour of Decision,
Oh, yeah.
published way back in 1933.
Mhm.
And this book really, it's not messing around, you know? It goes right for these big topics like the fate of Western civilization and, why do powerful movements take hold of people? And are we, on the road to some massive global conflicts?
It's really something how Spengler, even back then, was looking at the political scene and like the dynamics between these powerful nations,
Yeah.
and even throws out these predictions about white and colored world revolutions. I mean,
Right.
talk about intensive.
It's a lot to take in, and Spengler, he goes deep, and we're going to try to pull out, some of the most thought-provoking parts of this book for you.
Yeah, let's unpack it all.
Okay, so right off the bat, Spengler says, look, history, it's not just a bunch of random events happening.
Mm-hmm.
He says civilizations are like living things. They have a
Yeah.
lifespan, they rise, they fall, and he thinks the West is getting close to its end.
You know, one of the things that's so striking is how he compares the West to the Roman Empire. He draws all these parallels, like how the Romans became obsessed with wealth and luxury,
Oh, yeah.
and how their civic virtue, that started to decline.
Right.
And then how you had these powerful individuals who started, taking advantage of everybody else.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder if we're headed down that same path.
Do you see any of those same trends happening today?
Well, I mean, you think about it, we've got this massive wealth inequality, right?
Yeah.
It seems like people are less engaged in civic life than they used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's fair to say there are definitely some powerful people out there who seem to be, bending the rules to benefit themselves.
Right. Yeah, Spengler also noticed this interesting thing about the time period between 1870 and 1914.
Yeah.
On the surface, things looked pretty peaceful.
Right.
But he says underneath, all these tensions and forces were building up.
Mm.
And eventually they exploded, in World War I.
Right. It's like the calm before the storm, right?
Exactly.
Things aren't always what they seem.
Yeah.
Spengler calls this the illusion of peace.
Mm.
And it's all tied into his idea that, history moves in these cycles.
Okay.
And he says there are these two big forces that are driving these cycles and creating all this tension,
Okay.
rationalism and romanticism.
Those seem like pretty different ideas.
Yeah.
Like, break those down for me. How do those lead to problems?
Well, Spengler thought that rationalism, while it emphasizes reason and logic, it can become too abstract, too detached from, actual human needs and emotions.
So people get kind of lost in their heads and they forget about the human element.
Exactly. Yeah. And then on the other side, you've got romanticism,
Yeah.
which is all about this like powerful yearning for something greater than yourself,
Right.
which, isn't a bad thing in itself.
Sure.
But Spengler argues that it can get twisted,
Okay.
It can turn into extreme nationalism or these really fervent emotional appeals that just sweep people up and they can't think straight.
So both extremes can be dangerous.
Yeah, that's right. And what's interesting is that he sees both of these forces at work in these big political ideologies of his time, like communism and fascism. He's not saying that they're the same thing,
Right.
but he's saying they both tap into these really powerful undercurrents, that can really destabilize a society.
Okay, this all ties into what Spengler dramatically calls the White World Revolution.
Yeah.
What exactly is he talking about there?
So he's talking about a revolution that's happening within Western civilization itself. He sees it as this struggle between the old ways and the new,
Okay.
this clash between tradition and all these forces of modernity.
Right.
It's like a society turning on itself.
So what are some signs of this revolution in action?
Well, Spengler points to the decline of traditional authority.
Okay.
Like, think about how people are less likely to just blindly trust institutions these days.
Right.
He also talks about the rise of mass democracy, which he saw as potentially problematic because, it could be manipulated by people who knew how to appeal to the masses.
Right.
And then there's the increasing power of economic forces,
Yeah.
money talking louder than ever.
So it's like everything's being shaken up.
Yeah.
And the old structures are losing their grip.
Exactly. And what really worried Spengler is that all this internal struggle is making the West weak,
Yeah.
vulnerable to what he called colored world revolution.
Okay.
It's a loaded term for sure, but what he means is.
We're back and still digging into Spengler's The Hour of Decision. And before the break, we were getting into this idea of a colored world revolution, which is a pretty charged term, as we said.
Yeah, it's important to remember, the context Spengler was writing in and his whole worldview.
Right.
What he's really getting at is the rise of these non-European powers on the global stage.
Okay.
He saw the West's internal struggles, this white world revolution we talked about, is making it vulnerable, open to challenges from these rising powers.
So while the West is busy fighting with itself, other civilizations are getting stronger and ready to kind of step into that power vacuum.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Spengler saw this as a huge historical shift, like a turning point in how global power was balanced. And he even pointed to some specific examples like Japan and Russia.
What did he see in those countries in particular? I mean, they seem pretty different.
For Spengler, it wasn't so much about their specific political systems, but more about these civilizations embodying a different form, different cultural essence.
Right.
That he saw as fundamentally at odds with the West.
Okay.
He admired Japan's strong sense of national unity and purpose.
Okay.
Even their willingness to use military force to get what they wanted.
That's interesting because it seems to kind of go against his critique of romanticism leading to extreme nationalism.
Right, and it shows how complex Spengler's thinking really is.
Yeah.
He's not saying blind nationalism is the answer.
Right.
But he's recognizing the power of having a shared cultural identity and a shared purpose, especially when you're facing what you see as a threat.
Right.
And with Russia, even under communist rule, he still saw a distinct cultural form that he thought was ultimately incompatible with the West.
So it's like he's predicting this future where different civilizations with totally different values and ways of looking at the world are going to be battling it out for dominance.
Exactly. And this all goes back to his idea that history moves in these cycles.
Yeah.
He saw these clashes between civilizations as inevitable, like a recurring pattern throughout history.
He was writing all this in 1933, just a few years after the Great Depression. Did he see any connection between economics and this rise of global conflict?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Spengler was deeply suspicious of what he called the money powers.
Yeah.
The financiers and industrialists,
yeah,
who he thought were gaining way too much control over governments and societies.
Mm-hmm.
He saw this as another force that was weakening the form of nations.
Right.
Making them vulnerable to unrest from within and manipulation from outside forces.
So even back then, there was this concern about economic forces driving political decisions and maybe even leading to conflict.
Yeah, it's a theme that feels even more relevant today, don't you think?
Definitely. Now, let's talk more about this idea of form, which you've mentioned a few times.
Sure.
It's a pretty abstract concept. Can you give us some concrete examples of what form looks like in a civilization?
Well, think about ancient Greece, for example. When you picture ancient Greece, what comes to mind?
I think of their incredible architecture, their sculptures, their philosophical debates, even their democracy.
Exactly. All of those things are expressions of the Greek form. Their art, their political systems, their way of thinking, their values. They all fit together into this coherent whole.
Okay.
It's what gave them their unique identity and allowed them to flourish.
So form is like the DNA of a civilization.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's the underlying code that shapes everything a civilization creates and how it interacts with the world.
And what happens when that form starts to weaken, like Spengler thinks is happening to the West?
He says that societies become formless. They're driven by mass politics and economics. They lose their sense of purpose and direction.
Okay.
Think about our society today. Do we have a strong, unifying cultural narrative, a shared sense of purpose?
It's a good question. I mean, we have a lot of different ideologies and values all competing for attention.
Right.
But it's hard to say if there's one big story that unites us all.
Exactly. And that's what Spengler was warning about.
Okay.
He thought that a loss of form makes a civilization vulnerable to decay from within and threats from the outside.
It's a pretty sobering thought. So in Spengler's view, how do world wars fit into all of this?
He saw world wars as both a symptom and a consequence of this decline of form.
Okay.
As civilizations lose their inner cohesion, their sense of purpose, they become more prone to conflict both internally and with other civilizations.
So it's not just about political or economic rivalries. It's a deeper cultural crisis playing out on a global scale.
Right. Spengler thought that world wars are this desperate attempt by declining civilizations to try to reassert their dominance, to recapture their lost form. But ultimately, he thought these attempts are doomed to fail because the underlying problem is the weakening of the civilization itself.
This is heavy stuff. So based on Spengler's analysis,
Mm.
what does the future hold for the West? Is he totally pessimistic?
Well, Spengler wasn't exactly known for his optimism,
Right.
but he did offer a glimmer of hope, although it's a challenging one.
Okay.
He thought that the West could potentially avoid total collapse if it managed to rediscover its Prussian spirit, that spirit of discipline, duty, and will to power we talked about earlier.
We've talked about Prussianism as this kind of antidote to the decline of the West, but I'm still not totally clear on what it looks like in practice.
Okay.
Is it about military strength or is it something else?
For Spengler, Prussianism wasn't about blind militarism or aggression.
Oh, okay.
It was about cultivating a certain inner strength, a spirit of self-sacrifice and service to a higher ideal. He saw it as a way to counter the individualism and materialism that he thought were eating away at Western civilization.
So it's more about a cultural and spiritual renewal than a military buildup.
Exactly. He thought that the West needed to rediscover a sense of shared purpose, a willingness to put the needs of the community above individual desires.
But is that even possible in our modern world?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Can we as a society find a way to balance individual freedom with a sense of collective responsibility?
Right.
Can we rediscover a sense of shared purpose and meaning in a world that often feels so fragmented and chaotic?
Those are some really big questions, and honestly, I don't know if I have the answer.
It's okay. Spengler's work isn't about giving us easy answers.
Right?
It's about challenging us to think deeply about the forces that are shaping our world and to grapple with these big questions facing our civilization.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to take another quick break. When we come back, we'll explore what all of this means for us today, how Spengler's ideas might help us understand the challenges we're facing, and what, if anything, we can do about it. Okay, welcome back. We've been really digging into this book by Oswald Spengler, The Hour of Decision.
Mm-hmm.
And man, this book is, it's a lot. It's like he's throwing down this challenge, forcing us to really look at these huge historical forces and think about where we're all headed as a species.
It's not just about history, though. Spengler's ideas, they have implications for us right now in our daily lives.
Yeah.
He's challenging us to really look at the world around us in a new way and to ask ourselves some tough questions about, the direction we're going in.
Yeah, and one of the things that really struck me was this idea that revolutions, they're not just these political events. They can happen within a civilization itself, this kind of cultural and spiritual upheaval that can be just as transformative and just as destructive as any war.
Yeah. That's what he calls the White World Revolution.
Yeah.
And he saw it happening all around him in the early 20th century.
Right.
And what's so striking is how much of what he's describing, seems relevant to our own time.
It's kind of eerie, isn't it?
Yeah.
The decline of traditional authority and the rise of mass media and, the manipulation of public opinion, the growing power of corporations, the influence of money in politics.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these are all themes that Spengler was talking about almost a century ago.
And he also saw this deep sense of unease and anxiety. Among people.
Right.
This feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the direction that Western civilization was headed in.
Yeah.
He thought that this feeling of unease was a symptom of the White World Revolution.
Yeah.
A sign that the old order was breaking down.
Okay.
And something new, but not necessarily better, was emerging.
So what did he think this new order would look like?
Well, that's where his idea of the Colored World Revolution comes in. We have to remember, he's writing from a very specific historical context, and his language reflects that. But what he's really getting at is the rise of non-Western powers and the decline of Western global dominance.
Right.
He thought that this shift in power would lead to a clash of values,
Okay.
a fundamental conflict between different ways of seeing the world.
And he saw this clash as basically unavoidable.
Spengler believed that history moves in cycles, that civilizations rise and fall.
Yeah.
He saw the White World Revolution as a sign that the West was in decline.
Okay.
And the Colored World Revolution as the inevitable consequence, a new set of powers rising up to challenge the old order.
It's a pretty bleak outlook, to be honest. Is there anything we can do to avoid this fate? Does Spengler offer any solutions?
Well, he does, but it's not a simple answer.
Okay.
He thought that the West could potentially renew itself, but it would require a really radical shift in values.
Okay.
A rejection of the materialism and the individualism that he saw as the root cause of the West's decline.
He talked about a return to what he called the Prussian spirit, right?
Yeah.
But what does that actually look like in practice?
Prussianism, for Spengler, it wasn't about, military strength or aggression.
Okay.
It was about a certain inner strength, a spirit of discipline and duty and self-sacrifice. He thought that the West needed to rediscover a sense of shared purpose.
Right.
A willingness to put the needs of the community above their own individual desires.
It's a powerful idea, but is it even possible in the world we live in today?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Spengler's vision requires a really fundamental transformation of our values and our way of life. It's not about, turning back the clock or rejecting progress.
Right.
But it's about finding a way to balance individual freedom with social responsibility.
Yeah.
To rediscover a sense of shared purpose in a world that often feels so fragmented and chaotic.
As we've been talking about Spengler's ideas, I've been thinking about how relevant they feel to so many conversations we're having today. Debates about globalization, the rise of populism, the growing distrust of institutions. It's like we're living through this time of really intense change and uncertainty.
Yeah.
And Spengler's work gives us a way to make sense of it all.
It's a lens to view the world through, a way to understand the deeper forces that are at play beneath the surface of events. And even if you don't agree with everything he says, you can't deny the power of his analysis.
So what does it all mean for us? Where do we go from here?
That's the question Spengler leaves us with.
Yeah.
He doesn't give us easy answers or simple solutions.
Right.
He challenges us to confront these uncomfortable truths about our civilization and to take responsibility for shaping our own future.
It's a heavy responsibility, but also an exciting one in a way, because ultimately it means we have the power to choose the path we take.
And that's the most important takeaway from Spengler's work. We're not just passengers on this train of history. We are the engineers, the conductors, the ones who decide where this train is going.
Wow, that's a powerful image. It reminds me of that famous quote from William Ernest Henley's poem Invictus, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul.
Exactly. We have the power to shape our own destiny, both individually and collectively.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Oswald Spengler's The Hour of Decision, I want to leave you with this thought. What kind of future do we want to create? What kind of world do we want to live in? And what are we willing to do to make it happen?
Those are questions worth pondering. Thanks for joining us on this journey into Spengler's thought.
Yeah.
We hope it's given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to take some action.